This is a History of Western Thought number 19 on Stoicism. This is our second video in a discussion of the philosophies that arise during the Roman era. We began with the Greek era, from the pre-Socratics going through Plato and Aristotle, and then we just began moving into the Roman era. And the first of those philosophies, which was dominant within Rome, was Epicureanism that we spoke about. And now we're talking today about Stoicism. From here, we're going to discuss Middle Platonism, and then we will move into Christian philosophy and then Neoplatonism. But with regard to Stoicism, this is a philosophy that was popular in the ancient world, but also retains a significant impact today. And so while you don't have a large group of Epicureans today as you did within the ancient Roman world, you do have individuals that still call themselves Stoics. And there are a number of authors and self-help books that identify themselves with the Stoic philosophy. Well, the beginnings of Stoicism. Now, there are a number of major figures within Stoicism, and Stoicism, like Platonism, has a series of schools of thought within it. And so we actually have an early, a middle, and then a late Stoicism, much like we have Platonism, Middle Platonism, and Neoplatonism. However, it's really only the writings from that later era that still survive today. So we do have some idea of early Stoicism and Middle Stoicism, but that's really only gained through the reading of other authors rather than through the writings of the Stoics themselves. So the originating figure of the Stoic movement is a man named Zeno of Citium. Now, Zeno is not the Zeno that we have spoken about before. His years are 334 to 262 BC. Like the other early and Middle period Stoics, we don't have any of his writings today. He wrote his own book that was titled The Republic, just like Plato's Republic. That was a counter and a response to Plato's Republic, one of the most famous, well-known works within the history of philosophy. And it's really unfortunate that we don't have this work because it's a rather significant one. And this is not an instance of someone only having a small piece of work or someone who didn't write very much and the little they did write just so happened not to survive. But we have what probably would be considered a major work in philosophy that simply does not exist today. Maybe it's one of those mysterious works that was destroyed at the Library of Alexandria. And so we have various branches of Stoicism that roughly coincide with these different periods of Stoicism. Now, there is one branch of Stoicism that focuses pretty much narrowly on the questions of ethics. So Aristo is the primary figure that would represent this branch of Stoicism. There is also then a broader Stoicism. And this broader Stoicism has ideas about philosophy more broadly, talks about questions of metaphysics, a lot of the things that we have been talking about with the other earlier Greek thinkers. Now, Stoicism is eventually going to become the dominant philosophy of the educated Roman elite. And this is where Stoicism is most well known today. So if you talk about Stoicism, and ask somebody if they know any Stoic philosophers, if they're able to give you any singular name, it's most likely going to be Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius, his work is still pretty widely read. Along with Marcus Aurelius, other well-known Stoics include Epictetus and Seneca. Again, those who were Roman elites. And so Stoicism becomes the predominant philosophy of the educated class in Rome, which also means that it's going to have a significant impact upon discussions that happen within early Christianity in the Christian Roman era. Now, the Stoics divide philosophy into three specific subjects. Just as today we speak about three primary branches of philosophy as ethics, metaphysics, and epistemology, the Stoics divided their view of philosophy and what constituted philosophy in a similar tripartite manner, though not exactly the same. First, the Stoics spoke about physics. And physics does include what we think of scientifically today as physics, but it also includes metaphysics within it. The study of being, or that which is literally beyond physics, beyond just the questions of the functioning of the natural world. Though to some extent, for the Stoics, all reality is natural, or at least physical. The second branch is logic, and logic also would include the entirety of what is known today as the trivium. So it includes language or grammar as well as rhetoric. And the third part of philosophy is ethics. Now let's talk about the metaphysics first of the Stoics. And again, remember that metaphysics also for the Stoics includes physics or scientific discussions. The Stoics rejected Plato's realism. They rejected Plato's view of the forms. This idea that there are universal categories that are not just linguistic categories, not just mental categories, but universal, objective, ideal realities. The Stoics argued that in order to have being, something has to be able to affect some kind of change toward other things, and it also has to be able to be changed by other things. This means that being, in the way that it's described by the Stoics, is significantly different from the source of being as you find in Aristotle, where the source of being is one who is by definition unmoved, as he is an unmoved mover, though he changes other things that being, that source, that unmoved mover cannot be changed itself. For the Stoics, reality is inherently material. Now that probably raises some questions for us, because there are ideas that simply are not inherently material, that just form the way that we look at the world and form the way that we think about the world. For example, we can speak about time or space as such, not talking about physical things that exist within space, but just space or place as a whole. How do you make something like time physical, or the laws of science physical, or even the laws of logic physical, which the Stoics spent a significant amount of time on? Well, they recognize that there are some things or ideas that we speak about, that we use in the way that we interpret the world, that are not inherently physical. However, those things for the Stoics don't properly have being. And so they have some kind of existence, but they are not being. They are not foundational reality, because foundational reality really is, for the Stoics, material. The forms, or the ideas, or the ideals that Plato speaks about, that Aristotle developed ideas on as well, for the Stoics exist only within the mind. They only exist in the intellect. So they are ideas and words and concepts that we use to communicate about the world and to understand the world, but they do not have any actual existence outside of the mind. This is an idea that is known as conceptualism, which is opposed to an ontological realism that you find in Plato or Aristotle. To find more information about that, again, watch our videos on Plato and Aristotle. If ultimate being is that which is physical and not that which is immaterial, this also means that for the Stoics, the soul and God must also be material beings. This differs heavily from the Platonic conception that predominated of the soul, as well as the Christian conception of the soul as immaterial. Now, even though they believed that reality was primarily physical, or being itself is exclusively physical, the Stoics rejected the earlier physicalist philosophy of atomism. Atomism, if you remember, was the idea that all of reality is made up of these tiny little particles called atoms, and those atoms are indivisible. And all things are made up of these little indivisible parts that account for both unity in the world as well as diversity and motion within the world. For the Stoics, reality is not composed of these little atoms. Instead, it is composed of elements. Here they're drawing on some earlier pre-Socratic philosophers, arguing that material reality is composed of things like earth and air and fire and water, the four elements. The Stoics also rejected this idea of an empty void in which basic reality moves. These elements, the the four elements that we talked about here for the Stoics are in constant motion. And it is this constant motion of those elements that accounts for the change that occurs within the world around us. But these elements are not so basic that they can't not be broken up like the atoms. Instead, these elements are infinitely divisible, which means that if you were to get some kind of super-powered microscope, if you were to look at the most basic elements, you would continue to zoom in and be able to see smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller particles that make up these elements to the point that you would never come to an end. The microscope would be able to simply zoom in ad infinitum. There is no end to the process of division. Now, the Stoics do speak of God. They are religious. They are not a completely atheistic group. Not many people are at this time. And they refer to God as Zeus, as many of those within ancient Greece did. That doesn't mean, however, that they really mean what we think of as the mythical figure of Zeus in using that terminology. They do speak about God as that which brings life to reality. And so God is life-giving. This God, as they are speaking about him, is connected to fire, going back to the philosophy of an earlier figure that we discussed named Heraclitus, who argued that God is fire and all things are composed of fire. Similar to Heraclitus, then, the Stoics promote what really is a kind of pantheism. The idea that God exists and God does bring life to the world, but there is this intimate connection between God and the world such that there is no clear distinction between God and the world itself. In some way, God actually forms the world in that he is part of the world and we are part of him. This is distinct from the later Christian doctrine of God, which is going to argue for an ultimate transcendence of God, though not a transcendence in which God is divorced from the world. And pantheism usually is referring to a kind of monism, some kind of idea that all things are one, and underneath that is God, and all things are one with God, and God is one with all things. For the Stoics, as they look at history, they argue that the cosmos, the universe that exists, is eternal, and it is in a constant cycle. And this is a cycle of recurrence, so that the things that happen once are necessarily going to happen again, and history essentially repeats itself over and over and over again. And if we were to go to the infinite past, we would see these cycles simply going on, and going forward toward the infinite future, we would similarly see these cycles going on. And so there is no beginning and there is no end of history. And so something like what we see with the seasons, where we have the same 4 seasons repeating year after year, the entirety of history works in a similar manner. The same kinds of events happen over and over and over again. But within this broader cosmos, humans do have a special place within the Stoic system. And what is that special place? Well, essentially, humans have rationality. And this rationality is what sets humanity apart from animals or plants. And this rationality, this way of understanding the world that humans are capable of, that other things are not, is referred to as the logos. The logos is this mediating reason that is identified by the Stoics first with God as the one who was ultimate reason and has ultimate reason. And then secondarily, that reason is in some way given to us. So we share in what is that logos, that eternal reason. And so it is that eternal reason that both connects us in some way to God, but also connects us to the world and allows us to have understanding of the world as well as self-understanding. Now, because of this kind of monistic tendency in the Stoics, all things are united, and therefore all of nature works together. And if all things are in some way one, that means that when one action happens in one part of the universe, it is going to affect other actions as well. And there is then, within this broader monistic system, some kind of telos, or some kind of purpose within the world. Now, the Stoics are determinists, and this is probably what is most well known about the Stoics. They believe that human beings do not really make choices. We are not essentially free creatures. There is a kind of appearance of freedom in what we do and our actions and in the ways that we function in the world, but those are not real free choices. Now, the Stoics do say that we actually do make choices. They are not denying that we have wills. However, their argument is that the choices that we make are always going to be dependent upon our character. And that means that my character is always going to lead me to choose the same thing in the same set of circumstances. And so that means that if I were placed in exactly the same set of circumstances, because of my character, no matter how many times that occurred, my character would cause me to act in exactly the same way. And so that means that while there is a kind of choice and that we actually do make decisions, this is not a really free choice, in that there was really no possibility for us to make any other decision in that particular set of circumstances. And then finally, let's talk about the ethical system of the Stoics. As I said, there are branches of Stoicism or schools of Stoicism that really only focus on these ethical questions rather than the broader metaphysical ones. Well, the Stoics do have a kind of virtue ethics, just as we saw within Aristotle and within Plato. Virtue ethics is really the predominant way of thinking about the ethical life within the classical world. For the Stoics, however, virtue is really its own end, rather than any kind of means to anything else. This, again, is differentiated from the later Christian approach, in which there is an emphasis on virtue and the development of personal virtue, but that development of personal virtue serves greater ends. Those greater ends might be the good of the whole, what we just simply call the good, being God himself, a reflection of God's own goodness within the world, and then the Gloria Dei, or the glory of God, being the final end of all things. But for the Stoics, virtue, to live a virtuous life, is simply an end in itself. We don't need any further justification or reason for living virtuously rather than simply the goodness of virtue. Human beings are created for the Stoics to be part of this interconnected cosmic order within this kind of monistic system. And because of that, virtue forms this cosmic system in some way. It is the natural orientation of that system. And we are there in order to exhibit that virtue or to be virtuous. And human beings are naturally teleologically oriented. Teleologically oriented means that they are oriented towards ends, or they are oriented toward goals. We live with goals in mind. We want and need some kind of end to our action, purposes for our actions. And we are, as humans, guided by reason. And so to be a virtuous man is to live in accord with reason, as is oriented toward a good telos, so that we act in a way that we are working toward what is good for ourselves, for the cosmos. Virtue is, as I said, an end in itself as we partake of that broader virtuous order, and we do that through the use of reason. And so through the use of reason, as we live a life of virtue, there are particular virtues that the Stoics emphasize. And we see within virtue ethics, different virtue ethicists and different ideological movements throughout history have a different list of virtues. But there are 4 virtues that the Stoics focus upon, and those are justice, courage, wisdom, and moderation. All of them, again, like everything else for the Stoics, are interconnected. They are not totally separate ideas or virtues. And through the use of reason, the human being can choose to develop or habituate himself toward these virtues so that they deepen within one's personal character. The Stoics often like to speak of people as examples of virtue, like to hold up particular individuals as examples of the virtuous life that others should and can follow. And we do this, of course, today, and I think every human culture has their heroes or their saints or those individuals that we look at as examples of how to live a worthy and good life. But the Stoics were realists about the world. They did not believe that we had these perfectly virtuous people to imitate. They recognized that humans are flawed beings, and that nearly any example that we give of someone who lived virtuously in some area of their life did not perfectly display virtue. There is talk within Stoic writings of this perfectly wise sage. And the perfectly wise sage is more of an ideal than a real historical figure. But this idea of a perfectly wise sage as someone who is to be emulated is one who lives in perfect accord with reason, who exhibits those four virtues that we spoke about in all of his actions in the world. And as we hold up people as at least partaking to some extent in this ideal, we attempt to imitate that within our lives of virtue. Now, Stoics have a more narrow definition of the good. What I mean by that is the Stoics, when they're speaking about the good, are really talking just about the life of virtue. And this, again, is part of that idea that virtue is not towards some greater end. There is no really greater good beyond virtue. Virtue simply is the good. Virtue is the goal that all things are oriented toward. So something like health, for example, that Platonists and Middle Platonists and Neoplatonists would refer to as something that is good or partaking of the good in some way, is really not under that umbrella of the definition of what is good. We're speaking specifically about virtue. Now, to live a virtuous life is, for the Stoics, most famously to live a life that is without passion. And by passion, what I mean here is the giving in to one's inner impulses to simply act, or what we may think of as erratic actions that are driven purely by emotions rather than by reason. For the Stoics, just as for Plato and most in the classical philosophical traditions and the Christian tradition, reason is to be a guiding force for the virtuous person rather than emotion. Emotions fluctuate. Emotions are generally not a reliable indicator of what is a good decision. One who makes an emotionally driven decision without stepping back to think about the consequences of one's actions is making often a very wrong decision. And so reason then is to guard our decisions, to guard our emotions. And so it has this ability to check our emotions. And we want to act out of passion. We can use our reason to ask questions about the action that we want to take. Is that a rational action to take? Is that action in accord with virtue? Is that action actually going to benefit me in the way that I am feeling like it will? And so for the Stoics, people are not to be or should not be taken into fits of passion, whether that is anger or lust. Those kinds of passions should not drive our decisions in the world. Now, Stoics certainly acknowledge the reality of emotion or feelings in the world. In particular, they do speak about things like pleasure and pain. They don't ignore these realities. But unlike the Epicureans, who we talked about last time, those aren't going to be the driving factors of the decisions, or shouldn't be the driving factors of the decisions that one makes in the world. We do not make decisions purely with the questions of pleasure and pain in mind. And another element of life, the ethical life for the Stoics that we do often speak about, is the submission to the reality of fate in the world. And that is that for the Stoics, we simply have to take life as it is. If we understand that we cannot control nature, if we understand that we cannot even in the fullest sense really control ourselves, then this does give us a kind of freedom. It gives us a kind of freedom to say, I can't really change reality as it is, and so therefore I can simply live life as I want to live life here, recognizing what is the case. I don't have to have the stress or worries about some decision I made or another decision that I may make, because in reality there is no situation, there is no possible world in which I would have made any other decision, because that's simply my character. Things simply are what they are. And so this allows us to simply accept the things of the world as the things of the world without much stress. That's the ideal of life for the Stoics. But ultimately, for the Stoics, the goal of life should be to aim at something other than ourselves, and that is to be aimed at the virtuous, aimed at performing virtuous actions. Well, there are many things that can be said about the Stoics. This is just a small, short overview of these ideas that we find among the Stoic thinkers. And in the next program, we are going to begin looking at the Middle Platonists. Thanks for watching. Make sure you subscribe and comment. God bless.